Greetings and welcome back. In the first mini lecture, I tried to get across the notion that traditionally international relations scholars have made the claim that alliances make a country stronger. That essentially the choice is to build up your own military or find a friend and have your friend come in and help you if you're involved in a crisis or a war with another country. The point of this article is that alliances are a lot more complicated than that. And even if you believe that in the majority of cases, alliances make you stronger, better, safer, that's not always true. And certainly, we believe that the French case of the Rhineland crisis is a great illustration of where this dependence on an alliance partner, in this case Britain, undermined France's unilateral actions, and that the French could have and should have repelled Hitler and the Nazis unilaterally, that they were the stronger actor, and they failed to do so. The case study of the article is the Rhineland crisis of 1936. I mentioned that France's chief objective was the containment of Germany through a very complex alliance structure with pacts with Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, through the Locarno Pact, which guaranteed the western borders of Germany. And that is a crucial point because even Germany had pledged to support those borders. And of course, they violated the Locarno Pact when they crossed the border and reoccupied the Rhineland. So that's where I left you. Hitler was making this challenge, and one of the first temptations, and I've heard this from students several times when I've introduced this article before they've read it, is that this notion, well, the French didn't resist Hitler because they were militarily weaker than Germany during the crisis, and it's easy to come to that conclusion because if you look at World War II and Germany's invasion of France in 1940, the French did not put up much resistance. And so the temptation is to assume that the same thing would have happened 4 years earlier. Well, a whole lot of things happened in those 4 years. But in 1936, when this crisis took place, the French had a much larger military establishment than the Germans. They had a much larger air force, a much larger navy than was available to Hitler. And the French had the largest and most prestigious land army in Europe. And as I mentioned earlier, Hitler had told his generals that if they faced resistance in the occupation of the Rhineland, to immediately withdraw. And of course, there was no reaction, so there was no withdrawal. I want to bring up a concept that I used in a different context, and I want to bring it up right here, and that is this notion of objective versus subjective reality. Mentioned earlier, remember, with class differences in Britain, that objectively class differences aren't really much different if you take a look at wealth inequality, income inequality. They look very typical of other countries, but that subjectively this notion of class permeates Britain, subjectively, psychologically. And that's what we have here in the case of France. Objectively, as I just mentioned, the French had the strongest hand. They were militarily the strongest actor. They had no need to rely on the British. They easily could have repelled Hitler in 1936. But subjectively, the underlying premise of French policy after World War I was a haunting sense of weakness shadowed by fear and worry. They were physically depleted. They believed that they were inherently smaller and weaker than Germany, and that the Germans were inevitably going to come after them again and were going to be victorious unless once again they got help from countries like Britain and perhaps even the United States. Now, the British response to the crisis is even more intriguing. because if you take a look at their Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, and the British, when Hitler invades the Rhineland, which again was a clear violation of Versailles, of the Locarno Pact, what was Stanley Baldwin and the British foreign policy response? Well, the British interpreted Hitler's actions to be merely a German occupation of German territory, that no great harm had been done, and that if in fact Hitler invaded France itself, then of course they would guarantee Locarno and Versailles. And of course, that didn't happen, as it turned out. The British actually ended up entering World War II because of the German occupation of Poland. The German occupation of France came much later. But the paradox of this crisis, and I go back to this central point, is that France was quite capable of expelling the Nazis from the Rhineland and even advancing into Germany in 1936 on their own. Even German sources agree on this. Instead, the French explanation for their inaction was the British failure to support them, to publicly come to their aid, to send in troops. And there's a couple of good quotes, and I want to read a couple of them to you. I know you can read on your own, but the fact that this actually comes from the foreign minister of France at the time makes this really intriguing to me. So this is former French Foreign Minister Georges Bonnet, if you want to follow along on page 112 of the Political Science Quarterly article. He talked about his country's response the year before the Rhineland crisis, when Germany announced it was going to rearm, which was in violation of multiple clauses of the Versailles restrictions. And here was his quote: "There is no doubt that France was then capable of undertaking and establishing, even if she had to do it on her own, another Ruhr occupation which occurred after World War I under Poincaré. But we hesitated and marked time. We sent notes, we protested half-heartedly, and in the result we merely irritated the Germans and exposed our internal weaknesses. We complained to the League of Nations. So at a time when there was nothing between our armies and the Rhine, no Siegfried Line, no modern Air Force, no Panzer divisions, we let ourselves be publicly humiliated." And I think that is really true. And then another foreign minister then said, well, okay, in 1935 we didn't respond when Hitler violated the treaty by rearming. Well, what happened when Germany entered the demilitarized Rhineland zone? And I've moved to page 113, and here is what the premier, the prime minister of the country, the leader of the country said: "The most important opposition to military action was from our foreign allies, who would not march and who were even opposed to our marching alone. Opposition from French public opinion, which refused to risk war and was led by a press and by political parties that were also opposed to war. Opposition from the military services, which were not ready for a victorious test of their war preparedness. Thus, one after another, all the instruments of action broke apart in my hands, and it was necessary to decide to negotiate instead of fight." One last quote, and it might be my favorite. You will, of course, notice by the name of the author, you can guess which of the two authors decided he had to have this in the article, given the name. The author's name is Robert Frankenstein. Of course, I had to have Frankenstein in my article. But his analysis, in my mind, is spot on in this case, and here is what he says. He points out that France's supposed dependence on Britain appeared sometimes as an alibi to justify their own appeasement action towards Germany. And as a matter of fact, more firmness against the Reich on the French side might have pushed Britain to adopt an attitude of resistance. If France, with her continental interest and her frontline position in front of Germany, lacked political will, how was it possible to imagine that Britain could have been more resolute? And here is my favorite quote in the article. How could the British be more French than the French? And I think he's absolutely right on. In this particular case, how could a Frenchman expect the British were going to respond to Hitler when they themselves were unwilling to respond to him, even though they were by far the stronger actor? The article then gets into some domestic aspects, and here you are very, very equipped to analyze this section. I've exposed and talked a lot about the domestic aspects of both Britain in the 1930s and the weakness of the Third Republic during the 1930s. You do have to realize that both countries had one thing in common. And the one thing that they both had in common was widespread pacifism, and the memory of World War I was traumatic. It had taken away a whole generation of young men in the war. But domestically, their political situations were incredibly different. In Great Britain, as I pointed out earlier, the Conservative Party, and you should know which party was governing during the crisis. The Conservative Party governed through the 1930s, including the crisis. I discussed earlier the 1935 Conservative landslide. That election was historic in that 1935 election was the last election in British history in which any political party received a majority of the vote. So the Conservatives received 52% of the vote, an overwhelming landslide, which meant that politically both Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain had solid and overwhelming majorities to govern. The one thing that the article doesn't mention, but you already know because I discussed this in great detail with you earlier, is keep in mind that Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain promised. There was polling. I told you I did another study that I never published, but I looked at British public opinion from 1933 to 1935. And I told you that in Britain, when Adolf Hitler was elected to be the new Chancellor of Germany, there was overwhelming rejoicing in Britain. The British believed that Hitler was a moderate, that Hitler would be easy to deal with, that Hitler had been wounded in World War I and would do anything possible to avoid a second world war, and that we must do everything to stabilize and help Hitler govern in Germany, because if we don't, the Germans might throw him out of office, and perhaps a wacko will take over as the leader of Germany. And so the British public overwhelmingly embraced pacifism, appeasement in negotiations. And of course, I talked about what is the responsibility of an elected official, and I'll get more into that in the next article when I read you what is one of my favorite quotes by Winston Churchill later. But I said that representatives can take one of two positions in representing their constituents. They can be delegates, that is to say, what is it the people want, and they deliver what the people want. That is what Baldwin and Chamberlain did. Baldwin and Chamberlain were good Democrats. The policies they enacted, and they were horrible policies, but the policies that they enacted were the policies that were overwhelmingly endorsed by the British public. Winston Churchill was the trustee in this story. He's the one that is saying, don't listen to what the people want. The people are misinformed. They're uninformed. They don't understand what a dangerous character this is. Gentlemen, there are worse things than losing an election, like possibly losing our civilization. Do not do what the people want. Do what is in the people's interests and protect them from this war lover. I'll talk more about this in the next tape.